This is what you want. This is what you get. This is what you
You have located GeekFest Rants, the entertainment podcast for genre geeks like you.
Shall we play a game?
Covering the world of vintage and current film and television since 2010.
Game over, man. It's game over.
Featuring in-depth conversations on sci-fi, horror, fantasy, comics, toys, and conventions.
So say we all.
And now sit back, relax, and enjoy today's show.
Talk to Enterprise.
Enterprise.
Beam up.
What is it about the animated series that spoke to me? When we first started doing a podcast about the animated series, I put a poll out asking, what was your favorite episodes or whatever, and most of the answers came back like, there was an animated Star Trek series? Between 6 weeks and 12 weeks is how long it took from beginning to end to have the TAS out the door. If this was made today, Dorothy would be the showrunner. She was DC Fontana, so people didn't know she was Dorothy Fontana. So as Dorothy would be writing, you would have people doing storyboards to show what it would look like. Once the script was locked down, you'd have voiceovers starting. So while the voiceovers were happening, they would make layouts. Basically, this was showing the other artists what the person looks like on this end. This is what they look like if they're turned over here. Once that happened, you can move into actually starting to do animation.
Live long and prosper in your world, Commander Spock.
Some of the first, it's kind of crazy how many there are, was the first holodeck episode. It was called the Rec Room. It was just a room that could create environments. It didn't have the ability to have people and anything like that yet. It's also the first time that you see a Klingon vessel shoot from the front. So I'd like to think that's what led to the ones in Star Trek The Motion Picture actually doing that. I think TAS really kept Star Trek in the public consciousness because you had the cartoon coming out on Saturday mornings, and that actually got a lot of press as if it was a regular evening nighttime show. And I think it really, in the fans' minds, kept it fresh, and it reran into the 70s. It was nice to see that every new iteration of Star Trek seems to have a nod to TAS somewhere in there.
Hi, everybody, and welcome once again to GeekFest Rants. My name is Carlos Perone, and today we're going to be talking about animated Star Trek shows. Joining me, I'll have James once again, and we will both go over not only the original animated show, of which there's a book out that you guys can purchase and go over the entire history of how that show was put together, but we also have a couple of newer shows in the Star Trek family that are animated, although different styles of animation, that we are currently also watching. So let's begin with our animated Star Trek show.
Television is not the truth. Television is an amusement park. Television is a circus, a carnival, a traveling troupe of acrobats, storytellers, dancers, singers, jugglers, sideshow freaks, lion tamers, and football players. We're in the boredom-killing business.
Okay, once again, as I mentioned before, we have James joining us for our animated Star Trek discussion. Say hi, James.
Hello. I'm working off my crimes, and now we're going to do another one. Pretty soon, I'll be a free man again.
I hope somebody's keeping track of this, because I'm not. So today we want to talk about Star Trek animated shows because, we've kind of, even before the current shows were on, I remember that we had briefly mentioned once in the past that, hey, we should do something about the original animated show. And the original animated show is something that I hadn't seen till way later. And to tell you the truth, I don't even know if I ever finished watching the original animated show. Did you watch it when it came out in 74, or did you watch it later when they, I guess, reran it like everything else?
So I would say, I can't swear to it watching it in 74. Actually, let me correct you, it was 73. So that's when it launched, September 73, which makes this the 50th anniversary just passed. But I can't swear I would have seen it then, but I definitely saw it in the middle 70s somewhere. And they would play it on Saturday mornings, obviously. And as the way those things work, sometimes they would make a handful of a series of a Saturday morning cartoon. Smurfs, Scooby-Doo, Speed Buggy, those Laugh Olympics, those type of shows. And they would make what we would think were hundreds of episodes because you would watch them out of order and you would catch them over the years and things like that. But it would turn out they'd make maybe 20 episodes. It was essentially like one television season. and they might have just stretched it and then started rerunning it depending on its popularity. Or then you'd get it in a so-called syndication like, Channel 11 or Channel 5 or something years later. But this one, I definitely remember seeing it and being thrilled and shocked even because it was real Star Trek voices. It was the real actors doing the voices. It was the real look and sound effects and things like that. But it had this goofier feel as a kid compared to the Saturday night one that I was watching because obviously I was getting syndicated on Channel 11 in New York. Channel 11 I was getting. And so I fell in love with it. But again, I would catch it, and then when you're a kid, it's not always appointment television on a Saturday morning because you're out screwing around. And there were very few times I would probably sit there straight through to watch all 20 episodes.
And that was also before VCRs. So it's like if you miss it, you miss it.
Yeah, I feel like I didn't properly watch it till it came out on a DVD box set. Yeah. It was like an orangish box set that I had and had the plastic cover. And it was a big deal when it came out on regular DVD. I'm going to say early 2000s ballpark it could have been. I mean, my timeline could be crazily off. So sorry if everybody knows it better than me. But I bought that box set. I watched them again. And just as a cursory watch, I didn't study them. But then in the past year or so, I watched everything again, the original series, the animated one, in its proper order, because I followed them according to how they were filmed, according to a book writer. I think it might have been Robert A. Altman or somebody of that nature. There was a couple of those books that came out, and I went through each episode and followed what they said. And they did a section, a later book of the animated series, and then the build up to the motion picture. And I found myself feeling like I'd seen them for the first time and loved them again even more, probably because I'm an adult now and I can appreciate them. And I realized what I'm watching was pretty historic because of the fact that it was taken seriously by the producers, the writers, and the actors. Now, there were some things we'll get into about who didn't show up, who wasn't able to participate financially, things like that. But boy, as everybody has said throughout the years, it became the de facto fourth season of, year 4 of the 5-year mission for fans because it was pretty realistic stories written by many of the same writers. So I loved it. I still love it.
Yeah, the show itself for me, again, I didn't catch it till way, way later. And it is a little confusing if you're just a brief, Star Trek fan, and whether or not this is canon or not, or exactly how does it fit with everything else. It's a little more fantastical and outrageous because you have that latitude when it comes to working with animation. And that's one of the things they mentioned on some of these interviews is that the writers were given free range to be as creative as they wanted to be.
Yeah, let's do it as if we had an unlimited budget, which they still had a budget, obviously, for the animation.
Oh, definitely.
But if they had a live action unlimited budget where special effects and monsters that were fantastical would look great or something like that. And they did get a little carried away with some things. And they did the typical animation repeating of cells. So it looks like when somebody's running, it was just a body kind of moving on a generic background or something like that. There were versions of that. And every show has done that, from the Flintstones to, modern things to save some money. Yeah. Unless they have primetime budgets like The Simpsons, Family Guy, and stuff like that. Those older shows, they had to cut corners sometimes. And if a team of people were running, they would just show the bodies running on a blue background or a generic hallway or something. And again, it's okay. There were some silly things, but the stories felt I'd say 80% like Star Trek and not Saturday morning kids stuff. Even though it was a Saturday morning kid show and it had to apply, Yeah,
that's the interesting part about this is that when the show was pitched, and we have to kind of look a little bit at the history, and I get a lot of this from one of these latest books that actually I'm still in the process of reading, which is all about the animated. It's the one with the big orange cover and then it has all the characters in the front. Yeah. And they talk about how, yes, Star Trek was over. It ended on the 3rd season, and then the reruns is what really kept it going.
Yeah, it was over. It was completely. Everybody was on to other things. Nobody was. The conventions were either just starting to happen sporadically or were about to happen shortly after it. But it was not. There was no motion picture. It was all high hopes and hopes and dreams of, I wish we'd come back.
And before they could even tackle the possibility of phase 2 or a movie, that's when from what I understand, both NBC and at the time Filmation also, they kind of pitched Roddenberry on an idea of bringing the show back in an animated form. And the back and forth that went on to convince him to do it involved him saying, well, first of all, this cannot be, even though it's going to be placed on a Saturday morning slate, we cannot treat it like a kiddie show. We cannot have little kiddie characters doing kiddie things. You can't be Smurfs, that kind of thing. They have to he wanted to treat it as if it was, like you said, a continuation of the seasons.
Yeah. And you know what? The fact that they did that, I think, preserved the legacy of the show. Because had they half-assed it and did the goofiness like they did some of the Happy Days and the Brady Kids and the Laverne and Shirley in the Army or whatever nonsense there was of these various, if they did the Beatles, they did everybody had a cartoon, Jackson 5, everybody. And had they taken it less serious in that period of time, even though it was only about a year, a little over a year, I think they would have lost the respect. The fans would have been there, but I think they would have lost the respect and like, all right, it's over. It jumped the shark. It's this silliness. But they took it seriously, and any revival people were going crazy for it at the time. But it could have really fallen apart, and they didn't let it, and that saved the day. And then they were like, okay, let's see what else we can think about.
Now, one of the ironic things about the show is that even though a lot of people would dismiss it as it being real Star Trek, this was the first time in 1975 when they had their second season finish that a Star Trek show wins an Emmy.
Exactly.
They won an Emmy for Best Animated Children's Show. In the past, the live show, the live action show, was nominated for a few things here or there, including Nimoy, but they have never won. So this is the first time that they actually, get a win.
And I think that also put it in a rarefied air. Now it's like, oh, well, this is respectable. This is an award-winning show. They could advertise it as such, and they could promote it. It was basically after it was done, because the second season was 4 or 5 episodes. It's the way animated stuff works is they'll have a first bunch. If it's good, they'll do another smaller bunch, and then they might ask for more. They just did it.
I think the first season was about 16.
The whole series of it was about 21 or 22 half-hour episodes. Yeah, so that's the point we're at. And yeah, I mean, I didn't know any of this at the time. I didn't know it won a daytime Emmy. I was a kid. I was like just thrilled to see the real Captain Kirk talking and the real Spock and everybody like that. You want to mention that they did preserve much of the cast except for one person, and he got to write an episode because there was no money for everybody. And Leonard Nimoy claims to have stood up his ground and said, if you don't have these people, I won't participate. And it was very rare for an actor to do that, because they could have had like some voice actor guy, and they also eventually had like Nichelle Nichols and James do multiple voices, and it turned out that also preserved the integrity of the show. And Walter Chekhov was not able to because of money, but again, like I said, they allowed him to participate, luckily as a writer, and he had branched out into that, writing scripts like that.
Well, a little more into that, according to that book that I think you own it too. I think we both have it.
I do.
Initially, they didn't want to pay for Sulu, Uhura, and Chekhov.
Exactly.
And for whatever reason, Nimoy kind of said, well, if you don't have Uhura and Sulu, I'm not coming. So they kind of made it happen. Now, with Chekhov, it was kind of weird, because it was like, well, then you think, well, why didn't he just include him too? Was there some weirdness going on? I don't know.
I read it was the diversity of the actors and the characters that made Star Trek special for its time.
That's what Nimoy was kind of saying, is that if you exclude those two, you're removing all the diversity. Because, you could say, yeah, well, Chekhov is a Russian.
Yeah, this is 1973. So everybody who's claiming now, oh, there has to be a new paradigm of diversity and inclusion in television, it's like, these guys were groundbreakers, and Nimoy walked the walk, so I think we've mentioned that in the past, how it was very important for this show, how they did touch on subjects that were taboo and difficult for the time, and him sticking up for these particular characters, these particular actors, it was a big deal of the time for various reasons, for a cast member sticking up for him and not just taking the loot, and also because of what made Star Trek special.
Now, not surprisingly, again, they didn't have the money for Chekhov, but they did have the money for Majel Barrett because she was going to play Nurse Chapel.
I wonder
we
why.
all know why.
and again, if you read the book, if anybody reads the books and the various, she earned her keep, so to speak, because she did sometimes 5 voices in an episode.
Most of the secondary actors did that. James Doohan, he was doing multiple voices. Uhura was doing multiple. Everybody was doing. Most of the secondaries were doing multiple voices.
That's correct.
And they also got a few returning, I guess you can call them guest stars from original episodes. So, for example, Mark Leonard as Sarek came back.
Yes.
Roger Carmel as Mud.
Those might have been some of the best episodes, too, having them and including those original actors, too.
Yeah, Roger Carmel as Mud, the Mud episodes. There was like a trilogy. This was the 3rd episode. And Stanley Adams, who was Cyrano Jones, another one of these weird, iconic little characters. I can't do his voice, but
I hear it in my head. Instantly, I hear it in my head.
The show also introduced, again, because they could go crazy with the style and the creatures, let's say, they introduced an alien character called Arix. And he's supposed to be the navigator.
Exactly. It's like you read my mind. He was there as if he'd always been there. You just didn't see him. Just the same.
But in this show, he's taking Chekhov's role of navigator, sitting next to.
But I mean, is they didn't treat him like, we have this funky new character. It was like, no, just a crew member. He just happened to be of a different race of alien, or that we had never seen yet on the bridge or on anything.
Also, as I mentioned before, the original pitch came from NBC and Filmation. But from the Filmation side, they wanted Roddenberry to go for Starfleet Academy. They wanted him to have the characters as younger versions of themselves and obviously not use the original actors and that's where Roddenberry drew the line and said, no, I don't want young actors. I want the continuation of what already existed.
How many times have we heard this? It's the Starfleet Academy thing won't die. And even now it's 20, 23, 24, 25 ballpark. And they're still talking about, and I guess green lighting Starfleet Academy. Who wants this other than people who want Starfleet 90210?
Well, we don't know for sure if the new version of Starfleet Academy is supposed to be the original characters young or a futuristic Starfleet Academy with other character. We don't know that at this point.
I know, but it's like, I don't want that. I want either the continuing adventures of Kirk and Spock or Picard and those guys, or what they've just created in the sense of the Enterprise G and the new adventures or whatever the lingo was, the legacy. And I think they're just wasting my time. So hopefully somebody surprises me or somebody wakes up and says, let's not go this direction. Let's put our money where...
Well, Filmation, which is a company that at the time we might not have been very familiar with it. But when you get through the 80s and part of the 90s, Filmation is a huge, huge company that touches upon just about everything we watch on Saturday morning. One of the things that you got to keep in mind is that not only they're dealing with a certain style. Yes. This is not the only style that Filmation does. They got the Super Friends. They got all these superhero shows with a certain style. But for this specific show, for the animated Star Trek show, and another tangent here, we call it Star Trek Animated Show. Roddenberry also made it very clear he did not want to be referred to as the animated show. To him, this was Star Trek, period. But the style is more to, if you guys remember He-Man, for example, where you have these unusual looking people that are kind of running almost very realistic, but also very cartoonish at the same time. And that's due to the process that they used of rotoscoping. And from what I understand, they actually used certain scenes from the original series to be able to trace the movements of some of the characters.
The opening of the ship and a few things of that nature were exactly what you said. But also their style saved money. And it's almost like there was a process or something, like they would take a frame out to make the movie go faster, and you would imperceptibly save time, but we would know something was up. The music would change slightly. There's just some process, and they would find a way to cut out slight movements that a full feature-length Snow White would never touch. But because it's a 20-minute cartoon, they could do it their way. And again, like I said, the running of the characters or the moving of the character, or they would stand still a lot and just show a close-up of their faces so they only had to move their mouths.
That's the trick. That was the trick for them, was that whenever somebody spoke, the bodies or their face would stay still. This way they only animate the mouth or maybe the eyes a little bit, but the rest of the body doesn't move because that takes more time and more money, obviously.
Yeah. And the stuff that they did was, like you said, it was the Super Friends and the various different Fantastic Voyages, the Archies. The Brady Kids was something that I was pretty into at the time, I guess. Fat Albert, obviously Star Trek. And it just went on and on, like you said, into the 80s, up to the He-Man era. And the leadership of it, pretty well respected, but they were TV producers. They knew how to make a production but save a buck as well, which kept them in business for quite some time.
The particular style that I mentioned before, not only did He-Man use it, but you guys might also remember the animated Flash Gordon show. There was apparently an animated Lone Ranger show.
Late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah, all these shows that use that very rotoscopy looking realistic character.
Flash Gordon looked nothing like the movie that we all love. It was more like the comic strip, and the characters looked more of the 30s, 40s style with some aliens and things that made it seem newer, but it wasn't takeoff of the way that we knew.
One of the things that some people point out, again, that makes it a little weirder than your usual Star Trek story is the use of color. Obviously, you're dealing with animation, and specifically the use of the color pink, which is something that the original show didn't use too much, like a hot neon pink.
Yeah.
And the story goes that two of the lead people in charge of the show, some of them suggested the color pink, and another guy apparently was colorblind, so he couldn't tell the difference, and it got through. Yeah, sometimes it was a mistake that they had to live with. For example, when they did another Tribble episode, all of a sudden you're dealing with pink Tribbles. It's like, what the hell is that?
Yeah, that was funny.
Another way that the show kind of lucked out is that not only were they able to bring the majority of the cast, the original cast, but they were also able to bring a lot of the writers. And believe it or not, it coincidentally, especially after what just happened now with the writer strike, when the show was being put together, they were going through a writer strike. And back then, the rules of the writer, the writing
loophole
was that you could still work if you wrote for animation. So you got all these writers who want to write to keep working somewhere while the strike is happening, and that's why they were able to kind of gather so many, known
top
names.
Talent.
Exactly.
And now I guess the only loophole I know of now is a foreign production. So like things from England and things could continue because they weren't part of the same guilds and unions and things like that, the American team. So some people who had previous work did it, and I guess you have to use your judgment to stay in solidarity, I suppose. I don't know everybody who's jumped over to the other countries to do productions, but I'm sure there's a handful.
Another thing that, and you mentioned a little bit of it, is there was a certain rough style to it all, because again, with animation, they're still trying to save money. So there are times where, like, if you blink and you miss it, but for example, a character, after a second of two of being on the air, part of his body might disappear. You might have the badge on the wrong side.
But nobody knew this in 1973 and 4 and 5 because you watched it once. You maybe watched it in the summer when it ran again or something, and you very rarely had a VCR or any kind of recording device at all, visual recording device, to catch that until many, many, many years later, which, sometimes that's nice. You lose the charm of that simplicity because now you're like, oh, did you notice that, it's like, yeah, well, they were doing a production and they just got sloppy. They did it after lunch that day and everybody had a cocktail or something. And
one of the tricks that they would try to normally use is to reverse an image so that, one guy's looking left and then you can make him look right. The problem they kept having was that because the Star Trek uniform has the badge on one side, then people could tell that if a badge shows up on the other side, that's because they flipped the cell.
Well, that's not just the animated. They did that in the live action, the original series, a couple of times. And again, nobody would have noticed it at the time. Maybe one or two sharp eyes said, oh, did that? But years later, when you're watching it the 100th time or the VCR or the DVD versions and now streaming, then you can see there's a fight scene and Kirk might have been, because they didn't get the full coverage, or there might have been something that happened and it's like, obviously they gave it away with the badge.
The show also had certain storylines that you could kind of say, oh, these are forgettable storylines, but they're storylines that later, with some of the movies or some of the other shows, they kind of revisit them. So, for example, Spock's childhood, you get that, JJ revisited that, the new show revisits that. So it's kind of like, people have been mining storylines from the animated show and brought them forward a lot.
And those were the ones that I loved. I love the episode where they show Admiral Robert April, whatever rank he was at that point. Now, they use Robert April in the JJ movies, I think. They use Robert April now in the Strange New Worlds. In the books, he became the de facto first captain of the Enterprise because of that animated episode he was in. And then, like you said, the Spock's family life as a child. And then a couple other ones have shown up elsewhere with characters or things that, if this isn't canon, I understand. But there are characters who have basically become full-fledged, Star Trek rank and file characters because of that animated show years later. And especially modern people who are probably our age or a little younger, who fell in love with the show later, have paid homage to it by including some of these. There's even ornaments recently. I think Hallmark did ornaments of the Arex and the Mress or whoever. They've definitely not been cast aside as this oddball thing from the 70s. That's for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And as far as firsts, some of the, or at least one of the firsts that you get to see on the animated show is a couple of episodes where Uhura takes command. She's the one who's in charge of the ship because the rest of the crew is doing something else somewhere else. And that's something that she never got to do, apparently.
I think all the men were incapacitated or hostage or cast out or drunk or something. And it was basically her and Chapel and Mress and a couple of other ladies.
Yeah, and obviously by the time we get to Next Generation, then you have so many episodes that Beverly Crusher and Troy and you have admirals that are female admirals, and it's like, okay, no big deal, who gives a crap, that kind of thing.
And that's what I'm saying. People should look back on that and say, wow, it was always there. We just didn't realize it. That type of diversity and female empowerment and stuff like that. As far as Star Trek is concerned, I'll say, and some of the other things we love, the ladies have been ass kickers. It's not like it just suddenly happened in 2000s.
And another thing about the show that I want to mention, before we move on to our next subjects, is that just like most shows around that time frame, the 70s and the 80s, they all had to have a teachable moment.
Yeah.
Not directly looking at the camera, but there's always like a lesson to be learned, for the kids.
Is half the battle.
Exactly. But in the, this was back in the 70s. So even though it's adult theme in terms of the storylines, they are a little kiddie-ish at a certain point too. You can't go too crazy with a Saturday morning cartoon. So the show ended in 75, I believe.
Yeah, I think it went 73 to 74, and then 74 to maybe the beginning of 75. That of their so-called first run or initial run, and then went into reruns or syndicated or strips. They called them strips, where they would put like shows or like cartoon 4 o'clock in the like that.
And at that point we didn't have to wait too much because you could kind of say, well, okay, 1976 and 1977, they're thinking about what could we do next. And that's when obviously Star Wars exploded and everybody wanted their Star Wars. So that's when the gears changed to television or to film. And we know that there was a period, if you think about it, motion picture, Star Trek 2, Star Trek 3, maybe a little bit of Star Trek 4 before they were saying, all right, we need a television show.
Yes.
And that's when things changed, and then Star Trek gathered more speed and things kind of moved forward. But as far as animation goes, they kind of went quiet for a long time. There were some kind of, I guess you can call them false starts at some point where they were trying to figure out if they could come up with something. Sometime in 1990, I believe, Paramount Pictures tried the idea of taking some of the next gen and the original characters and turning them into some sort of animated show, and that never got off the ground, which is kind of good if you think about it. So they tried going for it.
At the time, it would have watered down because it probably wouldn't have been as top quality as we would have wanted.
If I believe what I'm reading here, they tried again around 2000 to do some kind of a Quark show or like a Ferengi show, I guess, because of DS9.
Yeah.
And as far as 2003, they were trying once again to do something animated, but none of that stuff worked. It just never took off the ground.
I don't have anything in front of me to prove it, but I recall reading and seeing tidbits that they were considering it around the JJ universe, or not the JJ verse, that era. You know what I'm saying? Like that kind of stuff. There was talk of it. I'm going to say 2014, 15 ballpark. If I could find it, I would, I'll show you a link. But I remember hearing and seeing stuff and saying, yeah, I would like that. I always understood actors are getting old, actors are getting expensive, but animation is a little cheaper, and voice actors, or the hiring of the beloved actors for voices, is a little cheaper. And we could have kept going and going with other versions, and I always wanted more of the motion picture era style. They could have had their voices.
They do mention it here in this article that I was reading that, yes, around the time of the release of Star Trek, the JJ Star Trek, the thought once again came up, hey, why don't we try to do something again? And again, it did not happen. It was a false start. Now, what happened after this time, and again, we're getting close to now because everything seems to have happened now, very fast. Yeah. But before that, there were a couple of, on YouTube, you could catch, I guess, fan-made, and some fans are very professional, like people that work in animation, and they just like to screw around and do these things to see how people react. But I've seen some episodes of Next Generation or some of the other ones where they try to use the style of the original animated show, or even some animated show stuff, just to kind of throw it out there. And people are like, oh, yeah, I remember that. That's kind of weird how it looks. But not until... 3 years ago? What season are we on right now of Lower Decks? 3 or 4?
4.
4. Okay. So around 4 years ago, must have been around 2018, 2019 when they started working on it, I guess. All of a sudden, because there was this rush of Star Trek material, Discovery and Picard and Strange New Worlds and all these other shows that are still theoretically on their way here, sprinkled in there, they said, okay, we're going to do an animated show, which was Lower Decks. And we're also going to do another animated show, which is Prodigy, which is aimed more at kids. Now, let me hit Prodigy first because I kind of want to get it out of the way. And we talked about it once before. And at the time that we talked about it was when they just announced that the show was done. They were not going to continue past season 1. However, in between then and now, we found out that Netflix is now picking it up as a second season and maybe hopefully continuing it. So we'll see what happens there.
Yeah, it's still not my cup of tea, but I respect that they're trying to keep it going because there is a small but very loyal fan base.
Right. It's definitely aimed at a younger audience.
Or even a more modern audience, and that I might not relate to as easily. And had I watched it more, I might have picked up on it. I just haven't gotten to it.
But the characters are more kind of cutesy characters. They're more...
And they had that like when they do Young Jedi with Yoda. I don't know if it's Baby Yoda, but there's a Young Jedi group, and it has these weirder Young Jedi.
Now, the other show, which we mentioned before, is Lower Decks. Now, this is one that I started watching since the beginning. I am aware that the style of the show, the look of the show, while Prodigy is more of a CGI art, this one is more traditional animation,
but a more modern Rick and Morty, supposedly.
Yeah. Now I'm sure it's done with computers still, but I'm saying the look is the traditional flat look of an animated show. And like you said, yes, it's a Rick and Morty looking show. I never watched Rick and Morty, so to me it's all brand new.
Now, before we say any editorial on it, did you get a bad vibe at first when you saw or heard that it was coming and it was Lower Decks, and then maybe see some initial artwork or something like that? Because we didn't know Rick and Morty, did we not maybe get a bad feeling about it?
I try everything. I usually do not have an opinion until I see it. Yeah, Even if I hear it's trash, I want to see it myself, either agree or disagree.
I just had a vibe that, because they showed the new cat doctor, the new lady, and some other characters, and
way over the top. Star Trek, the animated show, is over the top a little bit, but this is way over the top.
Yeah, so I had a feeling based on just still pictures and stories about it, nothing else. They might have even been black and white pictures. I don't even know, but it was like some stills. I'm like, what are they going to do? Where is it going to fall? Is it going to be a complete mockery? And I'm going to say I was pleasantly surprised.
Definitely.
I love it. It's actually, to me, I tell people, the other one was the 4th season. This is like the 8th or 9th or whatever season. of the Next Generation universe.
Well, the thing about this show is, and it's funny because my son started to kind of cram through all of Star Trek, and he wanted to kind of go forward. And I keep telling him, you can't go forward without hitting the past first. And this is especially, out of everything, I would say this show is the most important one, where if you do not watch Next Gen or DS9 or Voyager or whatever, you're not going to get some of the jokes because they build the jokes so well.
If you didn't watch the animated series that we're talking about,
even the animated series,
you're not going to get some of the jokes. Many characters have showed up, and you're like, oh my God, I can't, like I said, I can't believe they went there, or they got that guy, or they went in. There was one episode where they went to like an archive, and they had the giant Spock even from the original, and nobody would even know why. Why is he there? Why is there a giant Spock? Why are these other characters there?
And even like controversial things or funny things or bloopery or like everybody's most hated episode topics, they show up in here too. They kind of, it's a callback to things that are funny and things that are special, things that are great and things that are awful.
They're irreverent, but they are so respectful in so many ways. And it's definitely written and created and acted out by people who like Star Trek. They're not there to laugh the shit on it. They're there to make an homage to it. And and it's really, the characters have shown up. Even Riker showed up at a certain point. I was like, there you go. Everybody's like, oh, is Riker? Was he a captain? They talk about it. We never heard it. It was only in the books. Well, if this becomes canon, which I'm pretty sure it is, I mean, to a degree, he was the captain of the Titan.
If you doubt whether this is canon or not, there's an episode we talked about a little bit before, which is the animated characters come to the real world in Strange New Worlds.
So you can't deny it.
You cannot separate those anymore now. It's there and live with it. Too bad.
And I love it. And the way things are, eventually they'll probably have a short term of 6-7 seasons or something like that. But they only do 10 a season. So if they can keep going, I want them to keep going because I just love it. I'd like them to butt up into, if they can, well, right now it's about 20-ish years before what we know as the Picard series. If they can get closer to some of that stuff, even if it's in a funny way and we see more of that, or if they bring the JJ verse in it, because that would have been around the Spock. I guess Spock would have disappeared at a certain point, and maybe they'll mention that, and that would get you back into the JJ verse.
They can do whatever they want. Again, because it's animated, you're not limited by anything. The voice talent is out there. I want to mention also that with the newest Star Trek shows, and again, we talked about this before, we had these things called short treks, which were these little episodes that we used to watch, and they kind of stopped doing those because there's just so many episodes now of real shows.
Yeah.
But this past season, they actually introduced a couple of short treks that were all animated. And once again, they went to the original style of the animated show. They did goofy little comedic thing. They're very short.
Some of the real actors, some of the real looks, and some of the real storylines. And, again, yes, they were a little bit more irreverent than...
totally goofy, yeah.
Those might not be canon, let's put it that way, but they're awesome in a lot. One episode in particular about the animated Strange New World, I just... For 5 minutes, I cried laughing so hard. It was just so great. I guess I can talk about it. It's not like it's a spoiler.
No, it was about
they're
Spock's
great. Maladjustment to colloquialisms and fun things and weird things. And it was just, you could never do a live action. Live action could never do it. It would be laughed at in not a good way. This was just made me laugh so hard the whole time. I sent it to you. I sent it to whomever who might not have wanted to watch it on their own or knew it existed. And everybody had the same reaction, at least to that episode.
Which is kind of like, in a way, how good that episode of the crossover from Lower Decks to A Strange New Worlds, because you had to adjust the character. You can't have a super goofy animated character acting that way in real life, even though they do act a little more strung out than your typical person, but they also kind of joke about the fact that, why are they talking so slow? And the other one's like, why are they talking so fast? It worked in both directions, which was really good.
Yeah, I definitely loved it.
What I wanted to mention was this last episode that I just watched. And did you say this was the season finale?
No, there was a second. There's one more episode. One more.
Well, okay, good.
Look. Obviously, we're going to have recorded this long before people are listening to it. So let's just say the second to last episode of the 4th season. Whenever you listen to it at home.
Got it. So what I wanted to mention about this one is that this episode, I had no heads up about it. I didn't know that certain things were going to happen, that certain people were going to be mentioned. And one of the things about this show, and I think I talked about it before, is that when they announced it and it was going to be called Lower Decks, the first thing that came to my mind was, oh, Lower Decks is the name of an episode of Next Generation that is one of my top 5 favorite episodes, which is the one where all of the ensigns are doing stuff, and at the end of it, it's kind of like a lighthearted episode. You barely touch on the main characters. They show up here and there, but that's not this is all brand new characters that are kind of learning around the ship. And the last couple of minutes of the episode is a gut punch to everybody because one of these characters dies, and it kind of blows everyone away that, oh wow, this is actually a dangerous job that these people have. So that always remained in my mind in terms of, oh yeah, Lower Decks, oh yeah, that's the episode I love. This particular episode, and again, spoilers, don't listen to it. Don't listen if you don't want to get spoiled.
If you haven't gotten to that season of Next Generation from 35 years ago, don't listen ahead yet.
This episode touches upon 2 events that are connected. One of them being another episode which, once again, it deals almost nothing with the regular crew. This is about when Wesley went to the academy and you had this other group of cadets that were trying these crazy maneuvers, and somebody died as a result of it. And at the end of it, he had to confess what happened, and the guy that got in trouble was the leader, who was played by Paris from Voyager.
The actor.
The actor, Duncan McNeil, is it?
Robert Duncan McNeil.
Robert Duncan McNeil. And what had happened behind the scenes, and I think, James, you could probably chime in on this too, is when Voyager was being put together, the idea was, because the character of Paris is supposed to be a bad boy who is kind of not in good standing with Starfleet.
Redeeming himself because of his heroics as the Voyager needs.
Right.
Health.
But the original idea was to use that character.
Yeah, and originally it was supposed to be, I think, Ensign Rowe but the actress did not.
Ensign Rowe was supposed to be involved. Correct.
She may have been more of the Chakotay character. But
exactly.
She was supposed to be part of the Maquis at that point that were melding together with the pure Starfleet crew to work together, blah, blah, blah. But certain actors weren't available or uninterested, and so they rewrote some of them.
Well, apparently in his particular case, they decided at some point that because he was responsible for the death of somebody,
you can't make him a hero now. He's never going to have that.
He's too damaged to give him a heroic turn. I mean, if I think about it now, I think you could have done it. I think it could have worked.
I think at the time they were worried. Now it's edgy, and it would have possibly worked to show his full arc.
And the other thing about that other episode is that one of the other crew members from that group that gets in trouble with Wesley is the crew member that dies in Lower Decks at the end. It's that lady, I forget her name, but she's the one that in Lower Decks, the animated show, which we just watched, all of a sudden we find out that that character is alive and is up to no good, and we find out that Mariner
was friends with the girl,
and she's still kind of upset and hurt at the fact that her friend ended up dying at this mission she went on. And then you kind of make all those connections, and you're like, wow, these people are really, really thinking this thoroughly.
That's what I'm saying. These guys have paid more than, casual respect to it. They've dug deep into stuff in many different episodes, showing characters that were goofuses that are now like big bads.
Yeah.
And so this particular guy was probably a side character that nobody ever thought of again, that other than the fact that it was played by the same actor who became the hero of Voyager.
Exactly.
And now they've kind of resurrected him off the scrap heap, and now he's a big bad. Or whatever he's going to be. We, at the time of this taping, don't know.
Not only that, but they ended up using his voice. He did come back to do the voice.
And it is the second time that he's been on. And there have been other characters.
Oh, yeah. They've used a lot of them,
They did an episode of how Boimler had Star Trek plates.
Oh, that's right.
And there you go, is a reason why they dug deep. Because we know about these dumb Star Trek plates from the Franklin Mint or whatever
the Bradford
it was.
Exchange.
Right, yeah, and you had some, and my brother had. I don't think I ever owned one at all, but my brother had many, and they're still in the vault. of someday I'll get 50 cents for each of them, but none of them have been broken, but there is a goofing on how Boimler had the Tom Paris plate, and they look like the ones everybody bought back in the 90s, and his voice was on it, like as if the plate was talking to him somehow.
But they're doing a good job, and this is the type of thing that whenever we're dealing with some kind of franchise, whether it's Star Wars or whatever, and we keep saying to ourselves, gee, wouldn't it be great if they just, I know they can't really afford to do another side movie or another side show, but hey, they can do a little animation thing where they can explore these weird little things. This is exactly what this is. And it's kind of like, fanboys talking to each other about theories about, hey, whatever happened to blah, blah, blah? Well, really, blah, blah, blah was really the same character.
And this is probably what that writer's room sounds like.
Yeah, they're taking those conversations and turning them into shows.
Yes, and it's fantastic. And the fact that I've said it on the Star Wars shows, I'll say it about Doctor Who, literally any franchise that we've liked that the actors have gotten older and maybe even passed away, why not take the property, the beloved property, and turn it into a special episode animated version or something, because you can do anything and they'll look as young as when they were, teenagers. And if the actors are still alive and their voices are available, use them. And if not, there's plenty of voice actors who can replicate the characters, as we've seen in Clone Wars and a couple of other animated properties that are fantastic. And this is proving it, because if it's not the real actor, sometimes they use voices or visions of some of these older characters that you could never get in, even CGI would be very expensive and hard to, other than like what they did with Indiana Jones. And they could only do that for a few minutes because that was a super budget movie. You could never do that on TV or anything like that.
Well, other than recommending not only this show, but the other shows we just talked about, I also recommend that Star Trek animated book. I mean, I got mine on Amazon, I think.
Yeah.
It's a couple years old, but it's great. And there's one book coming out about Lower Decks.
And I didn't know that. That's actually...
Yeah, so I already have that on pre-order, so hopefully that will be I'm not sure if it's a jokey book or a behind-the-scenes kind of book. I'm not sure yet, but I'm definitely going to get that because there's not a lot of merchandise having to do with Lower Decks.
No, and the last thing I want to mention, you spent the summer fretting over trying to find a Cerritos, which is the ship that is their ship.
And I finally did.
And you finally did. I got a Lego version, which is my deep dive, and I found the Lego version that I've yet to build, but I'm excited to build it when I find a place that I can put it. But also, their marketing campaign wasn't just, hey, look at the new Star Trek. They actually paid homage to previous Star Treks, because I think at least for the third and fourth season, they did a play on the Star Trek 3 Search for Spock movie, and they took the artwork for that poster.
Oh, that's right.
We love posters. And then they did it again for Star Trek 4 with that similar artwork, but with our Lower Decks characters. And these little, they just, they're not the first to do it. I know Star Trek Beyond did a version of the motion picture. A lot of people don't love that movie, but I love what they did. I've studied more than just watching it, the art that they did and some of the behind the scenes stuff they tried to work in. But yeah, these people, I think his name is McMahon. And I know he's a big, Star Trek nerd who loved the series. And it turns out the actors for the main characters for Boimler and Mariner are also people who love and respect Star Trek. They're just younger, they probably came onto it later, but they're into it too. They're not just actors taking a check.
Well, I also just read a little blurb that said that when he was trying to pitch the show and he was thinking about an animated show, that his favorite episode is the Lower Decks episode. And that's why he named it, because it's about the little people in the ship that you never get to hear about. It's their adventures, just like it was on that single Next Generation episode. So there is a super, super connection to that episode in terms of the inspiration for the show. And obviously the episode we just watched, it's right there, smacks right against it.
So to go hand in hand with shows we've done recently and years ago, the new people who are coming up, you always used to talk about Kevin Smith or Jon Favreau, like those guys, again, like I said, Kevin Smith, Favreau, many others, I'm sure. JJ used to be a Star Wars fan, he said, growing up, but he actually did Star Trek, brought it back, and was successful initially on it. These guys love it and try, and that's good. But I think now we're into the next generation of fans who were not even born probably when Next Generation was out and at its height, that they're now finding it and becoming big in the industry, or at least becoming influential, that they can get projects and participate in things. And that's actually a very good thing. These are people that revere it. It's not just people who find a buck in it. I'm always thrilled when people care. Doctor Who fans who have written and have become heads of the show. Obviously, Star Wars, there's new generations of Star Wars actors and behind the scenes who care about it, even though they're in muddy waters sometimes in fans' eyes. There's people who they really care. And that's the best we can hope for.
Yep.
It's out there and people are willing to pay for it, meaning the studios, and then the people, the creatives, are willing to. And I love it. I guess to follow that's just a follow up of our Star Trek episode from a couple months ago. That's all we can hope for, this new golden age.
Yeah, I'm going to now get back to finishing the animated book because I want to finish it because it has so many little tidbits and trivia things that are like, oh, wow, that's amazing. And waiting for my Lower Decks book to come. And I got at least one more episode now to finish. So I got a little bit left to go.
I'll rattle off like 3 things for the original animated show that we started off with. They were able to use almost a complete library of sound effects. And when they used the voice actors, in the beginning, there might have been 1 or 2 that the crew sort of got together and recorded in a recording studio around the same time, maybe not always.
Yeah, the first couple of episodes, they were able to put everybody in the same room.
So they sort of had their behind-the-scenes reunion, but then as actors were out and about working, maybe in other states or other places, they would send, say, if Nimoy was in New York, they'd send him to a recording studio in New York. He'd record his lines for however many episodes he had to, send it through the phone lines or wherever they used to send them, or mail the tapes, the blah, blah, blah. I mean, I'm simplifying it, but it wasn't like now where it was over the digital lines. And they were able to do it that way. And they didn't have to. And that saved people from having to always be in the same place. So an actor could go, he could be on location doing something, and Shatner could be doing a play or whatever things he was doing at the time, or, Kojak or whatever episodes, and he could be out there recording at the same time. That's what made it even more special, that they were able to cobble it together in ways that a live action just couldn't. And if they weren't available, they wouldn't have been able to participate.
Yep. All right. Well, thanks, James, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right, I hope everybody enjoyed today's show. We talked about all the different animated Star Trek shows that are out there, the older ones, the newer ones. Specifically having to do with the older one, the book that I kept mentioning, that we both kept referring to. It's called Star Trek, The Official Guide to the Animated Series by Aaron Harvey and Rich Shapis. This is a hardcover book that goes into all of the different episodes of the series. Very, very thorough book, as much as you could squeeze out of that topic. And then the other book that I mentioned that was coming out, that I have here in my hands, it's called Star Trek Lower Decks, USS Cerritos Crew Handbook by Chris Fernell. And as I mentioned before, this is a different kind of book because it is a little more jokey in terms of it's the crew handbook. And just the nature of that show, it's comedic. It's a comedic Star Trek spin on it. So you're not going to get the making of side that you do get when it comes to the other book. This is more of an in-universe book, but nonetheless really cool that they put the time to actually have this thing released. So once again, I'd like to thank James for joining me today. And as usual, you guys for listening. And we will see you here next time on GeekFest Rants. Bye-bye, everybody.
You are hereby directed to surrender for trial by the people of Dramia, Dr. Leonard McCoy, Medical Officer, USS Enterprise. This is some kind of joke?
The wanton slaughter of hundreds of people is not a joke, Captain.
Slaughter? Hundreds of people?
According to this, Dr. McCoy was responsible for a plague which ravaged the planet Dramia 2 some 19 years ago, Captain.
Let me see that.
As you will note, Captain, the warrant is perfectly in order, approved by your own Federation.
If you would like to subscribe to our show, send us messages, or see video links to some of the topics we talked about today, please visit our homepage at geekfestrants.com or our YouTube channel, Facebook page, or iTunes at GeekFest Rants.
I don't know what we're yelling about!
GeekFest Rants is produced by Carlos Perone. Copyright 2024.
This broadcast is part of the IC Robots Radio Network. Visit icrobots.com for this and many other nerd/nostalgia related podcasts. You won't be sorry for long.